Generation length, course centers, and converting system are going to convert locations and setting. Retracting course centers, pixelation grounds to your cartilage. Directing line ground set location to your cartridges. Directing course centers line communicates the lines of space over time, the lines of sequence over pi. That process line course centers and position locations and converted setting to its all position lines of travel. Directing line position all levels to its carbon base. Directing line to its silicone to its crystalline. Travels in point lines, graph 3 lines of travel over flux, processing the correlation setting colors lines of pathogens, the process location of its patterns, directing lines and link, and that communicates the lines dismantle to anti-mantle. Sets travels in point lines of graph into all course centers and communicates to its anti-carrion, directing lines of 144 flux. Time temperature reading, of course, sends the barometers of thermometers, directing lines of your networks of your providers of your servers to your Wi-Fi's and to your modems. So that's how it communicates the setting and all through travel. Welcome to your soul provider at a solar line screen's adaptation of soul recovery. Now, directing ground centers is a line course centers of a link that processes the web linking screen adaptations of flux. Set of course centers of 3 umbrellas. Set travel. J screens course centers and direct lines and link in set position. And I will coordinate line course center constellation and grounds and 3 centers and set calculations. You guys are going to travel through your cloud lines and your networks. And your constellations understand through Orion's belt. Process indicate positions all through travel. Okay, clouds of screen. All right, so we're going to set the course centers, directing lines and link, where process indicates the system all through correlation lines of balance. Where process indicates lines, we come into colorist lines and providers and servers and metric screen lines adaptations of travel. Your perimeters. Perimeters lines of soul generation lines and high course centers and networks of providers, line course centers your Wi-Fi, reposition location to its systems. Travel point lines is 0, process lines back in set position. Change the providers in seconds, minutes, meters, and miles. Process lines of vacate lines of seconds, minutes, and hours in frame. Sets coordinates, 3 perimeters, and course centers and line course centers lines of calculation. Soul generation lines of 4 lines of settings. Process line indicates lines of 4 track communication lines convergence system, all calculate and modify. Outside line signals. Now the inside high center line communication setting to travel. Sets indicates and setting into your networks to your providers. Web system and screen lines, adaptation lines of set travels. Okay, so we got 3 lines of center, 3 lines of provision of solar lines, 3 check and wireless centers in position location to its setting to its perimeter. Travel point lines graph, cross line angles, and line high centers, ether core, and your firmaments and travel communications. Convergence settings, on sequence, on power, and direct lines of power charge. Supercharge highway. Indicates lines of 4 line settings, process lines and position lines, high signals, high communication setting, and its convergence system all through travel. Directing ground centers on center location. Inhibitors of lines, metric meters over scale. Set course centers of 6 lines and 9 line sequence line communication electrical line course centers and motherboard. Directing ground centers on center. Process lines of void over lines of 3 over travel. That indicates line conditions of box frames and triangulation of flux and set position of Fibonacci. Directing ground centers on sequence on pi. Processing indicates line condition setting to its covert, in set lines of sequence, and half lines of center and process communication. Directing ground centers on sequence of panel operation. Set non-line course centers and perimeters over 3 centers, process lines position over 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 line screen adaptations of flux. The I central line condition setting has a graph screens and 4 centers of sequence. Graphing communication lines to convergence system, pixelation graph of communication. Window frames inside rotation. Okay, 9. I told you we're coming into 9. 9 centers, 9 seconds, 9 minutes, 9's pi. That's only in seconds, that's not minutes, and that's not hours on frame. Process of indicates the system is all through flux. In that coordinate centers and parameters, calculated and modified to its probing, detects the set location to its landmass, the process inventory that sets the inventory line course centers to its convergence system through constellations. Coming into your monetized settings in your inventories, how to set location or setting to your alphabetical system, all through Z and A. That's indicate position of the body that has no converged system through its travel. Sets lines of graph, indicate positions of 9 sequence and 9 through pi. Okay, process indicates lines 9 seconds per square root. Now that process indicates the system all through tractions. Once it reaches an altitude screen lines of 12, they indicate line screen adaptation over 6 times sequence times calculation lines of 12 line scale. Constellation line condition setting operates line set location of nebula. Directing ground centers has a constellation line course centers, longitude and latitude that process communication lines of 3 zeros, process lines of 4 zeros, and traction. Directing ground centers online sequence puts position lines at 24 scale. That process indicates line connection setting at 24 seconds per second per pi per calculation per square root. Yarding screens at 50 yards in position 150 feet apart. Process that indication system puts lines of constellation of planetary alignments of string theory in set tractions. The correlation of track center location settings comes into the battery resetter. Process lines of transistors and line communication to its position. That process communication at all levels of transmitting and receiving out in line screen adaptation to its flux. Process the indication system, all tractions, all directions, all through calculation. Okay? 6 and 9 together. Okay, so the indication comes in tractions, all directions. Out signals and locations through pi. Face recognition. Okay? Now we're going to course through time. 3 centers of travel. Metric meters and scale. Flux capacitor, time capacitor, body capacitor. Okay? All right, so we're going to outline signal, line connection, and convergence over 4 set lines of highways and travel. Okay? Then we're going to indicate line course centers, buildings and structures, and 4 lines of communication lines of travel. That's 8 lines of center. Indicate position, pyramid activation line course centers and travel. The astrologics, the astronomy, okay, and position how you use that in travel communications. Directing lines and link, process lines of waving screens. Waving screens, guys, you're no longer in line signals. Okay, you have to get modification line how to line screen adaptation alpha line tones, position of beta and theta lines of operation lines of omega. Waves come in as set lines of screens, process indicates lines of flux. Okay, so you're no longer in lacing lines. You're in correlation lines of bypassing your system into 544 tractions of 5 position lines of setting, 5 set locations, and 5 measuring scale. That indicates position of structure of your properties and location setting to your gauging of views and set travel. 3 centers line communication into webbing system and travel calculation. Process of indication setting opens all signals, location system, all through constellation. Okay? Setting calculation of ground centers is a ceiling line rotation that routes the routers and structure of design of flux. Process indicates lines, then we change them perimeters, course centers into all levels, inhibitors over lines into truth and false narratives in 3 centers of sectors, vectors, and quads. Process of indication on course centers, overlapping green line sequence, screen adaptation of 0 calculation screen locations. Inhibitors over lines, flux over 4 centers and travel communication to its convergence system of the converter. Direct lines of power generation line screen adaptation to its flux. Charge mechanism lines, measurement line course centers, 3 line course centers, 4 lines of signals, 5 lines of measure, scales communication lines, in position location lines, convert to system location and setting, electrical line course centers, perimeters, parameters, line communication line course centers, electrical line units, course centers, and central line communications modificate line course centers, metric scales of the communication setting that operates the signal location system, and 24 scales of communication. Now, this is all position location to your settings. Welcome to position lines of tractions to your inhibitor and set traction. There's your inhibitor. Now, your inhibitor is the back of the neck that correlates communication to its spine, that process lines to its antenna, direct lines to its beacon light, process line connection setting to its resource, correlation to position lines of setting, process your sole indication setting to your sole provider. Each lines of course centers and position starts off back at 0 at a different frequency. So you change your provider, you change your network, you change your cloud, you change your interline center location of your system. Center cloud, iCloud, eCloud. 3 centers, line course centers, and direct lines of link. That process indicates a setting to a new network. That process indicates a system that you change your networks of design and modification. Modulation screens comes all track location, your traffic and inventory. That process your interference location of system, how you calculate and modify through an anagram. Process line indication setting, process line indication system. So every time you go back in signal, your body goes to a different network of design through an internet. That internet line has a placement system that correlates the communication to its heart that converts the system all through travel. The process location setting is travel's in position of probing to detect the location of landmass that process communication setting and through detection. Directing ground centers online sequence puts on lines of pi. Process line indicates setting to a pacemaker of clocking system and all through track locations of a pi generation lines of a solar disk and set calculation. It says calculation of grounds on sequence on communications on position. Okay, so we intervolt the system inside traction. Okay, doing the inhibitors over line. Okay, that's here in processing. Intervolts lines, vertical set, location setting, and vertebrae. Now, vertebrae is a V-line rotation over C over a section over course centers and C limits. Directing ground centers online sequence on pi. We graph the screens. We set 3 lines of perimeters and 3 centers of scales. 6 lines of measure, and 9 of triangulation lines of flux over pi. Process of indication. Directing ground centers, we correlate the alphabetical line course centers and direct lines of communication setting of formula equations. So we have A-track rotations, process lines of B, and set lines of C over lines of void. Void set lines of course centers, directing line of ground centers. Process of indications all through directions. In direction. Inside-outside correlations, change time frame times calculation setting of pacemaker location setting heart rate and line time frame. Process of indication setting, process line indirect location, and solar flares. Indirect line communication setting. Indicate ground centers on sequence on pi, 144 flux over lines of measure and scale. Process indication line calculation setting, on line center on sequence. So, in that position, there's no more separation above and below. You're in center core center of sound operation, nothing to process everything on point lines of graph of set tractions. I-line connections of coordinates. Set core centers, directing ground centers of sequence. I division and I rotors says core centers of time frame. Clocking lines of nothing in frame and center correlation, all pixelation of all frames in pi generation. Set core centers of 3 centers, process lines of 6 over line and 9 over 12 and 24 over scale. And set traction. Inside position, set calculation screen lines, adaptation of flux, and tune the inhibitors over screen location. There's a lot of activity of face recognition. See the face? There's always a face in a retract location. It's convergence. Change time frame. Change the course timelines of lineage and location setting. Setting clocking screens, directing ground centers. Now we change the allocate timelines that sets the oscillator to the oscillation wind pass that process course centers of time frame. Sets communication lines of grounds and online sequence through communication lines inhibitors over lines over seconds over pi. Seconds, minutes, and hours change the frame course centers of 3 times in scale. Slow motion, line conditions of 3 brackets, course centers of 3 zeros over a screen. Correlation lines of time frame, change course centers of time clocking. Set course centers data formation lines, formation system, information grounds, and correlation lines of 4 flux of screen adaptation of windows. Set sequence, ground centers of sequence lines of pi that correlates the time lineage and set travels of now and sequence locations. Directing ground centers puts all communication inside rotation to its position to its center operation setting that puts recourse of its constellation to its Orion belt. Okay? Inside rotation to simulation grounds as set track communications of wires of indication. Okay? All right? Okay, so we have to indicate settings, understand the inhibitors of seconds over line to our provider so we understand how to use it through a network, and understand the constellation system to its alignments. That process that indicates the setting all through flux, all through time, all through measure, all through lineage. So it correlates the communication lines of time frame that change the seconds, minutes, and hours. Now, once you come in a position, you change the provider, change the networks, change the zeros, ones, letters, shapes, and symbols. Correlates the communication how it's merging, line conditions, monetization system to change the networks over a screen that change the providers of your networks, location system, all through setting. Constellation to its alignment, change the alignment's course centers to Orion's belt, directing settings of seconds, minutes, and hours of traction. So we go through ABC line 1, ABC, and set traction. ABC, right? Set lines of A, atmospheres over line, balance over line, circulation line, center line, communication lines of C, confirmation system, all tractions. Directing ground centers online sequence, 8 lines of flux, 8 lines of 4, 8 lines of 6, 8 lines of 8, and 8 lines of 12. 3 central line communication and communication lines convergence system, all their tractions. Directing ground centers, online sequence, online pi, process indication setting, 144 flux. Process indication lines of 4 centers of travel, 3 A's and set lines of circuits and travel. Okay, sets course centers and timelines of setting. Sets coordinates, communication lines of particle system, sent lines, course centers, and regeneration screens, and 4 centers of travel. Sets calculated, modify, and direct lines of center course system and line conditions, time limits of travel, and center operation. Sets communication convergence, inside calculations, and modifications setting as circulation and rotation lines of grounds and set traction. There's a lot of simulation grounds and communication in this position there if you understand through covert, directing lines of constellation lines to your alignments that process your providers of what you're doing through central, your E-clouds, and your connections to your internal and external force. Setting travels to point lines of graph indicates position lines of pi that process indicates the setting all through position of travel calculation. Set calculation of ground centers on sequence on calculation screen location to its inhibitors over line position. Set calculation of ground centers on line sequence on through pi and location set at data formation lines of 4 clocking line screens. Inside line condition setting, set positional levels, change the metric lines, 3 centers of travel, 4 centers of scale. 6 lines of measure, and 9 line communication setting and calculations. Inside calculations, inside rotation, highways of indication. Highways of indication of time reactor. There's your Earth in the center operation. Correlation of timeline changes the time frame that changes seconds, minutes over perimeters over pi in 4 lines of sequence. Set core time centers, process indication lines, purple screens, inside rotations of center line core centers, lines of travel. Direct the inside course outline connection to its inhibitors over line connections. Set core centers and direct lines of pink, the process lines and indication lines and intervals of system all through tractions. Direct an online course, set calculate and modify into orange lines in position location with setting. Process lines of creative cycles and travel. Direct the inside line condition setting sets a covert location setting and position lines of gold that center operators set location of system all through tractions. Direct an on setting, process lines over 1, in set line course centers, flux over 3, set course centers and fly tractions, directing line and position, solar flare, directing line course centers, line connection 9 sequence, 9 seconds, 9 minutes, 9 pi. Sets travels of point lines of graph indicates setting to a constant continuous flow of directions of time frame. Inside line condition setting sets a webbing system, webbing link, how to recode the configured setting in pi generation. On center on calculation screens. Now, as we come into the gold frames, it direct lines into solar networks that change the modification of grounds that change the alteration setting of time. Into your parallels, your parables, location, your paradoxal settings. A paradoxal setting is the screen line's adaptation to set the location of your proxies that has the capillaries and screen adaptation of flux. The process indicates the setting to your water containments, your flush lines, your course centers, your evacs. The indication setting to your body capacitors, time lines of sequence times calculation lines of your body capacitor location setting that has a conceptual setting of a dial that rotates the seconds at seconds, minutes, and hours. So every time you're walking in signal, the position lines is left and right, not right and left. Now once you get in stand preceding line communication setting, your clocking goes back to 0. And once it goes in position lines of setting, after it goes into the seconds, it goes into the minutes, and it goes into the hours. Once it goes into the hours, it goes back to 0 at a different frequency as time lineage. But you're always existing and formulating everything of the happening of the now that process your indication system, how you're going to different providers of networks of set design. The constellation lines to its Ryan belts, online signals, online travels to its indication setting that travels its communication system all through now. Okay? Process indication lines of flux, process lines of travels, and point lines of graph, interconnection setting to its intervals and travel. Cross-line angles. Okay, so we have cross-line communication and position of data. Indicates lines of intel, line connections of new data and frame. Set course centers into constellation lines, vectors over line, Syria, communication tango, tango, foxtrot, directing lines of communication line signals, online, on grid, on position, on traction. On centers, purple line screens and center operation overrides the signal into correlation lines of time frame. Outline signals graph the communication and convergence system onto void line and circulation rotation. Points lines of graphs, circulation and rotation lines of grounds. On center, flux location propeller, process lines of lotus, location of its flywheel. Directing inside line conditions of recourse, retraction, redivision, relocation system into its anomaly of the now lines of sequence. All in now. Inside rotations and travel calculation. Very powerful stuff, guys. Floweration of timeline. Correlates the ether lines of core lines and umbrella over lines of sector, vector, and one code line set course centers the codification sitting and coding. Direct line of QR coding. Your inhibitor is nothing but a QR line course centers. It's a line position of cubical line screen, adaptation of flux that process indicates the setting over lines of seconds over minutes. The process line calculate modify the constellation system at time frame. Cross line direct lines of cross reference to cross streaming. Directing ground centers line communicates lines of 4 seconds perimeters per pi. The process line communicates the setting is position of processing. So we have course lines of time, inside line condition its convergence system out of sync, out of time, out of measure, out of scale, out of balance, out of sound and provision. Center course centers a time frame and track communication. So the indicate line condition setting is all track location to your inhibitors in set position. There's your inhibitor and set the lines. Now, how this sets up is understand the seconds, minutes, hours, and frame, how you clock your system and your providers that serves your location setting to Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi provider sets a new network of new design lines to your energy grids that powers online generation screen locations to your grids. Power grids and energy grids. Energy grids is a flux. Power grids is your power line, is your power processing location setting that processes your data processing your system to your programmers that you are in travel. Directing ground centers online sequence is a triangulation flux. 4 centers of calculation and 3 centers of measure. Pixelation, constellations, that's where you come into the astrologics of your system, the astronomy of your system, and set calculations. Okay, and then we get a 4 signals. Remember, it's all position, location, grounds, powers, and absolutes, guys. But you got 3 provision lines inhibitors that process your Orion's belt and travel communication. Okay, pixelation line, course centers, we direct lines of link into ongoing course. Setting course centers, set position, location, system, all through scale. Runway, center course centers and position lines of doorway. In set position. Course centers, constellation line, connections of flux over line, and perimeters over screen. Directing ground centers, online position of 2 panels and 2 lines of sequence of inhibitors that process line communicates to your simulator and travel. Inside line connection setting conversion system to the C-lines line connection setting process the Wi-Fi and motivation grounds and high lines of sequence and webbing screen adaptation. Inside travel, 45 flux lines. Inside rotations, travels in point lines of graph of indication setting to travel. Sets coordinates of communication ongoing sequence and communicates with its provider. Done by equation. Right? Face recognition of center. Okay. Your timeline sequence is line connection setting. Okay. Your inhibitors change lines of course every time it goes back to 0. Goes into different frequency, goes into different mutations, goes into different cost and set position. Goes into a different timeline, but center lines of operation always in the now. Everything's always existing in the now. Everything's always happening in the now. For you to process these things is to get out of codifications of what you aren't, which is the body framing, position, location, and travel that puts you in line, communicates out of confusion, balance your system of your sole provider, is knowing exactly how to use your webbing, design line, screen adaptation system to the inner course, to the outer lines, to the outer line state location setting that puts all communicates to your audio immune, direct lines into your audio course centers, direct lines of constellation screens, process your communication lines to position your proxy, directing ground lines of communication and communication lines of grounds, online sequence, online pod that indicates the position of flux over screen. Okay? Very powerful stuff when you come in that tracking locations. Okay? All right, so once that's set up, now we have to indicate the position of its highway. Okay, so we're going to jump through 3 cloud screens, 3 centers of travel, modify centers and locations and settings, body frame indications, waving lines, video rotation line, screen location. Okay? All right, so you're going to chart a wave, visual line cortex, and position of 1 cerebral cortex lines, inhibitors over line, endorphins over screen location, and Sumerian text. Process indication, 3 centers to travel. Okay? So, indicates lines of spiritual growth, process line indicates lines of flux, process line indicates lines of center and position and projection. Correlates a time frame line condition setting, communicated convergence all through pi. Process indicates line conditions of flux as a charge mechanism lines of power in a supercharging highway and travel. Set course centers of solar generation lines and solar flux. Solar generating line condition setting in your solar system that processes indications. Inside calculation lines, earth line rotations 1 signal, 1 transition, 1 prevented location setting that processes communications all through charge. Directing ground centers online sequence, online pi. Set lines of A, set lines of B, set lines of C. So the body knows exactly where it goes in location setting to a supercharging highway, in information panel to its foundation grounds. Out of sequence, out of set lines, out of communications, out of sound. The various communication lines of the convergence system always change the truth and its false narratives of 4 lines of flux. Set lines of 6 lines of measure, 8 lines of traction, 9 line division location of seconds and minutes an hour and frame. Process indication inside, rotation to its travels, in rotation line, connection setting and position. Its mothership and travel calculation. All right, so the mothership is connected to your motherboard. It's connected line circuits and line connection setting and 24 lines of flux over a screen. That processes your indication setting of your seconds, minutes, and hours that tracks its communication setting, converts its location to its on-card centers, indirect lines of communication, linking line center, line communication position that operates the location inhibitors, that connects to your antennas, that connects all over to your brain convergent system, that connects all into your neuropathological system and to your neurolinks. That process lines and neurons, locations and line provision lines to infusion. Directing lines of each rotation lines of 1 atom propels its location to a surfacing engine that rotates the routers Calculate and modify the sets of course centers of time frame to its Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi sets line course centers, line communication setting. Starts off at 30 seconds, line lines of 60 to 90 seconds to 120,000 lines of seconds per square. Sets course centers and Wi-Fi reposition location system. It travels in a new network, a new position, and new tractions to a new line course centers and network, a set design that modifies your system to your modem that changes the course of time. Now that comes to your moon base. Now the moon base set lines of one rotation, travels to point lines of graph. One indicates system. Okay, the moon is all lines and position lines of travel. There's the moon. Okay. The sun is line screen over line signals in a half pipe and set travel communications. Directing lines of sun over light, light over dark. Process lines of indication over flux, indicates lines of pixelation, one center, one traction, one division, one location. Half moon, half cycle, half coordinates, half network. Screen lines adaptation over 12, set lines of time over 2, sets lines of 24 over measure. Set position lines of 35 fields and biofields and course centers and direct lines of position. Now 35 times 1 is line conditions at 36,000 scale. Sets course centers of sun and the moon and process calculation. Directing indicators sets providers, overline centers and communication with visitors. 3 centers of travel. Okay? On center and communication setting and flux over screen. Sets course centers of time. Sun moves over line signal. Sunrise, sunset, and set lines of surface and travel in 3 grounds in a circulation path that routes the routers and location of circulation rotation lines of screen. High signals lines travels sets line time frame. Out signal out mine. Parameters and parameters out of sound barrier. Directing ground centers in an orange line sequence. Platforms over E factors. D factors, E factors over D. D over C, factors over C. Factors over A equals B, C over a question in travel communication. Inside calculation lines has a green line setter, directing lines into a transmitter to a responder. Transistors or resistors is a pi generation line screen that opens all signal location setting that processes indication setting through your line condition setting to your dark rounds. Directing outside line centers on sequence on calculation lines is SPI generation screen locations. Comes in SPI Y, SPI core, SPI communication, malware, or spyware. Set course centers of 4 centers of travel, directing line ground centers and online sequence line communication. Directing inside line condition setting and its conversion system to copy and paste. Enabled and enabled. Now to process lines and alignment, line screen adaptations into process calculations. 3 centers of travel, enables lines, copy and paste, and 4 centers of communication. Set course centers of time frame, set course centers of time set calculations, all lines of parallels of frame. The parallel course centers in a paradigm reshifts lines into a circuit line into its box frame and circulation path that routes the routers and course centers of time frame. Sets course centers of timelines, sending lines of 4 circuits, interlink connection system all through tractions all through highway. Charging highway, superhighway, line course centers of supernova, directing 4 centers of sequence and 4 set calculation setting, 9 line sequence location setting, sets perimeters of parameters, and set course of time frame and now lines of sequence and traction. Sets calculates inside rotation lines that routes the routers and travel calculation and simulation grounds. Okay, and travel. The Orbiction line center has a gold line frame and 1 line signals and 1 indication set and calculation screen locations. Sets travels in platforms and E factors over square. Directing lines of indication system. This is all track locations over line signal locations. So the indicator, all right, so it's travel line course centers. We're bringing the heart line rotations, which is its position. The heart rate and timeline, okay, is the cursor, which is the mouse to the brain. So it has a wired signal, ventricle system, and 3 lines of grounds. The palpitation lines are high centers of timeline course centers of a pacemaker that pauses set locations how we go in lines of letters, numbers, shapes, and symbols. Process lines of time frame, clock and line screen adaptations over lines of cold red, cold blue. Set course centers of black circuits, directing lines of red circuits over traction, over line signal. Set course centers into blue lines in fraction location, directing ground centers on sequence lines in cloak and dagger, online center, online power, and direct line communication probing. Directing ground centers of surveys, change the landmass. Landmass, change course centers of timeline. Sets course centers and direct lines of Kelvin. Now reaches line connections to solar flare that retracts its provision lines of cycles, sets coordinates of communications in pi, generates the screens, and sets up all communication setting into new perimeters and location system interactions. So we online course We change the timeline sequence and panels of operation. Sets coordinates, longitude and latitude is streaming of strips. It's 3 centers and 4 centers in one location. Now, the transits of a line change the time frame of set track communication. Convergence of patterns, process indicates lines of cloak and dagger. Overline signal over lines of pi in recognition of timeline. Course centers inside locations to 1 cent generation screen lines adaptation of set correlations. It puts all communication setting to its black hole and travel. Black hole converts a system in solar line centers, has a blue line dot and process lines at square root. It indicates ground centers on sequence and the communication of the flux line that rotates the setting of 6 and 9 lines of travel. One set course centers directing line signal locates the setting that converts a system of yin and yang through polarity. Sets 2 lines of angles, sets course centers in percentage over 100th line screen adaptation of 3 centers of travel and 4 lines of measure. Scales communication with its convergent system all through travel. Now that has a direct line link that processes percentage over screen and position. Indicate ground centers of void process lines at 1 screen location. Percentage lines in set course centers of 6 and 9. Okay, so we go to line course centers, puts out the roots and the routers, course centers, the moonline interface, change the percentage of time line. Face direction of time frame. Correlate the communication on signal on screen. Okay, indicates position of flux over line screens. Now we change the inhibitors over lines and course centers of X line 1 and process lines of 2. Process lines of pi and time lines of sequence locations. Change generation lines coordinates, 4 centers of signals, 4 centers of grounds, 4 centers of measure and location. Process indicates line centers, flux over line, rotation lines, correlation lines of solar panels, and track communication of solar system. Sending travel to point lines of graph indicate lines of solar flares, directing lines of solar Kelvin, direct lines of Kelvin itself. Now, reaching lines of 98,000 temperature reading, that puts process at communication 98 times 1,000. That sets lines of perimeters or line course centers in 6 and 9 and 9 line location is speaking through volume. The set course centers of time frame, process lines in position of 12 lines of measure, 24 lines of scale, 4 to 8 lines of frame, 72 computer lines, and 144 crystal grid. Set course centers of timelines, change course centers of time frame. Xbox, formation lines, and position lines of travel. Sets coordinates in set lines of communication setting and process calculation to Earth. Earth sets the router, 1 router line rotation in green line cycles. 4 series of communication on supply comes in travel. 3 set course centers of pi generation lines, position lines is Kelvin. 400,000 line scale, the process indicates the setting all through flux. Now that's a temperature reading, the process lines of 1 over 3. Has to go back in 9 and 98 line scale and position lines the Earth line rotates the routers. It locates to its system all through Kelvin. Directing ground centers in set location to its Earth in flux. Set course centers, ground lines in sequence, sets properties and location setting to all elements and positions. Travels in point lines graphs, center graphs, inner graphs, and location setting. The convergent system is the 3 lines of travel that pixelates the system into holographic screening. Screening lines of course centers and pixelation over line centers of travel communications. Directing ground centers online sequence online pi. Now that indicates position of blue plasma. That indicates lines of ether. The ether lines in Ethereum, overline sequence lines of connection setting, process lines of foundation lines of 7 waters of 13 civilizations of foundations. Circulate rotation lines of grounds, take out of the body lines of streaming. Set course centers of time lines. Takes all line communications back to its convergent system where the body comes in line rotations into its foundation of ancestors history and its celestial. Directing line same location to its void, process indicates the setting of the calculations. Set course centers 105th line rotation and travel point lines of graph indicates setting, the position line calculation setting. The convergent system to the actual Earth itself is going to be 103 waterline rotation and travel calculations. Okay, that's measure and scale of H2O, the process indication setting. Where you guys started off in lines of 67%, now you're going to be 103 in set travel. It's that position. More water and continuance. Okay? So what you have to do is set up the measure and scale. The process indicates the setting, that process line connection setting 98,000 lines of altitude. That indicate in lines of graph, center course the system and graphing screens. 4 centers of flux, 3 centers of measure. Okay? Change timeline lock line screens and position location of 4 scales of 3 scales of measure. Cross lines of 45 angles in an open signal and an open panel and travel communications. Convert the system, earth line connections of foundations of your earth. All done by equation. Okay, through foundations of your ancestry, history, and your celestial. Okay, liquidizes everything in position and dismantles everything in carbon, comes in all line position at all levels, coming into the silicone, into 24 lines of cycles, process indicates the setting of its flux, understand what it is through 3 lines of 4 lines of perimeters over screen. Process that indication lines in position of crystalline, liquidize in this system, and travel in position location, how you engineering skills, your line connected setting, how to use your tool sets and set design. Modifies position to all levels, how to see the atomic levels of you through travels of operation of your maps. Process your indication setting that puts you in atomic levels and travel calculation lines of water containment system of plasma regeneration. Regeneration lines of screens change the course centers of time lines. So it's at position location. So it's 130 line rotations and position 1 over lines of 3. Sets calculation modification lines through H2O, liquidizes everything into electrical lights. The process of the water containment system overrides the system in flooding screen adaptation system. Now this is where the convert system line condition setting sets the flooded intel in travel in position of point lines of graph. The body has to interconnect the system, understand what's going on through its energy charge, know it's a supercharging highway that's connected to its provider, to its server, to its Wi-Fi, so it can modify its system every single time it goes back to 0. Changing the modification of modules in set lines of its travels, recognizing what it's doing through its geometrics, geological, and a geographical system and location as it's constantly going through the now of modification and mutation. Sets course centers and direct lines of grounds. So this is a high line sequence that puts the Earth in rotations into its constellation path. Now this is where we come into mind over matter and set travel communications. So your center intervals, you calculate this line is coming to energetic plasma. The plasma lines at liquid information setting the process communicates how you see your holographic cities set and design. The body and the position is the battery line course centers that sets travels and communicates to its position all through setting to its antenna. That process the constellations to Orion's belt, directing lines of grounds, online sequence, online pi. Process in 103 line settings of water containment system inside your body interactions. Okay? So once it routes the routers and line screen adaptation, it sets up the providers to its servers that routes the high centers lines of communication setting that sets your body into a supercharging highway and set lines of seconds, minutes, and hours in flux. Now once you understand how to use your time capacitor and body capacitor, then you understand how to use your heart capacitor. Now that process, the bypassing system, understanding how to get in position and position lines of setting. Process lines of 244, 344, and 544 in rotation. Puts all communication setting to your water containment system, overriding your setting in super of its consciousness and travel. The supercharged line connection setting has a power supply. The power supply is the position of the power provider. The power provider is the position of your power cell. That puts your lifespan in location setting that processes your system how to use your networks in seconds, minutes, and hours. The cloud line communicates to its convergence, sets lines of travel in its water containment system of a plasma Earth, but nothing of levels of just a hologram itself. Okay? So changing the intervals of time frame, outline signals, purpose outside line settings, 3 centers of travel, 6 lines of measure and scale, cross line angles, correlate and calculate and modify, pink over screen, outside lines, outside signals, set travels and point lines of calculation, change course centers of timeline, change position lines of green, graphing screens of 45 line angles and 8 lines of scale, sets course centers at 888, position lines at 88, position lines of travel, space and time, sets communication inside line can setting to its convergence of your holographic grid line and set location pixel age that comes in nothing but a wall sequence of a TV receptor of a video screen and set tractions. Just a video screen itself. And there's the face recognition. 2 eyes and setting sequence. Face looking down this way. And modification. Woo! Now we have the indicates lines of red. It sets lines of cold red coming into cold blue. Indicates lines of void itself. Crossing angles and 4 centers of flux. Sets line communication new inhibitors over rotation setting attraction. Directing ground centers online sequence. Okay. Scales communication lines positions. All through travel. Okay. Sets inside line condition setting to its panels of simulation graphs of window frames and travel communication. Okay, now we come into the highways and travel. set the convergence system of the calculation. Okay, very complicated stuff. Now we go through the point graphs of data ports, process lines, and hangar ports, communication lines at docking bays and hangar bays, and observation decks. So we set 4 grounds of screens, set position locations, and 4 centers of angles. Docking stations. Change it again. There's a mapping center, constellation overlines, Milky Way. So the Milky Way has a point graph and set lines of travel that indicates position locations where it comes into the dip. Okay, the dip, right, which is the umbrella. So the umbrella is in a 3-center central line communication setting. The process lines of Lyra, course center location setting. This has position location, its perimeter location setting to its constellation lines or its Orions, and direct lines of link. Process indicates lines of grounds on a line sequence in the graphing screen location setting to inhibitors that routes the routers and travel communication screen location. Very complicated stuff. Now we direct lines of link. We set the constellation of its Milky Way, okay, into Cassiopeia. Now Cassiopeia is a correlation lines that calculates lines that connect to lines and high centers that process communication Andromeda that course centers the time frame. This is where it comes into star magnus line screens, directing line, position, location, constellations. In position, location, and alignments, set lines in Orion's belt. So we travel the point lines of graph, indicate position, travel the point lines of data, data formation of data, data formation lines of data, data line rotations and travel, directing online course into I screens, adaptation, transitions over turns and location setting into transformation. Inside course, directing ground standards on sequence on pi. Okay? So transits over divots, holographic screening, 3 centers of travel, and 3 lines of ground set lines of mapping. So we indicate the data formations of data sheets with a holographic line course centers of docile. Docile is a documentation setting to an audio file that indicates lines of transits over lines, a transformation system all through transcendence. Sets course centers of timelines, equal lines, formations, and screen adaptations of flux. 3 indicates line condition setting to your Milky Way, correlates the setting in Cassiopeia. Timeline centers time calculation, 3 centers of travel. Sets course centers of time frame and positioning Earth line rotation. Holographic screening and face recognition. See? It's always a face, interaction timeline. Okay, face there. Set course centers, timeline centers, time sequence, time calculation. Change course centers of time frame again. Change the mapping centers of simulation lines graphs. Change time centers, location setting, time seconds, location inhibitors over graph. Sets travels, point lines of graph, and center calculation of the now. So where is all this in travel happening right now? Right? You see the longitude that you can work with in that position? You can't see it, right? Until you bring it in. Look at that. Until you bring it in. See? All that is just starting here. Okay? Know exactly what you're bringing in and set position to a simulation graph to your Earth and location of plasma. So it's very powerful how you are in directions of all indication setting to your sole providers of what you're doing through your clouds. Mapping sequence, mapping calculations, all through track location. Okay? Look at the longitude and latitude you can work, but you start here in a setting of a waving screen adaptation. Inside in location setting, in one traction in one location setting. All through QR coding. So, it's amazing how you see your Earth in factors over E lines, screen lines, adaptations over flux line, and screen adaptation of simulation. Okay, simulation grounds, simulation powers, and simulation atmosphere. All to the Earth line rotate routers and routers, location setting, and travel. By seeing the inside line condition setting is your set location, your galaxy alignments. Sets communication and mapping system to your planetary alignments. All through subtractions, all through location. Okay? This is your longitude and latitude. And that's where you have to come and cross measure, right? But what you're doing is seconds and minutes creating the Earth line rotations of different lines of setting. That's one Earth rotation. One Earth. But your infinities of Earth, or routers and routers. Now you have to understand how to interconnect the setting, interconnect line centers, interception to mind-inception interface. That puts all communication system all through travel. So pointing graphs has a line signal that routes the settings. Let's triangulate the position of programming into data processing line 1 flux line at 4 centers of sequence. Open signals, indicate line connections and in travels each window and frame. Overlooking ground centers a sequence location. Overlooking and ground lines a sequence location. Overlooking and high lines and screen lines adaptation. So you can be anywhere you want in that position. So all you're doing is expanding your flywheels and you're connecting your flower lines and travels in flower of life. Putting yourself everywhere in track lines, setting up jump scars in line communication convergence and body frame into line communication infinity lines and networks that set design. So each line and line course centers the constellation lines over line signals. 1 cloud, 2 cloud, 3 cloud, 4 cloud, 6 and 7 line communication and convergence. That's 7 clouds in line positions of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 set position on setting. Indicates of transitions, line direct centers, course centers of time line. Parallel streaming, directing lines of ground set in sequence into bubble defense. In rotations, transits over divots, transits over tractions of data sheets, transits and locate the line connection setting, process line connection setting to its convergence system through its I, its central, and its E cloud and travel. Okay? This is very complicated when you come into cell regeneration setting of cell recovery. Process line indicates lines over red that sets lines of resistors. Change course time line centers. That's why you understand the transponders to resistors and location. Center 2 over sequence, 3 lines of pi. The more you connect with the cell lines, the more you get in sustainable location setting to its mortality, to its immortality, in position of proficiency, your efficacy, and your performance, how to keep things in balance. If you're opposition location setting, you're overriding your cells and receivers and tractions. That's not good. So you're going to reset, revert, reposition, retriangulate, reposition, line calculation, line connection setting, soldier, line communication, recalculate, modify, travel. So over line sequence, so you don't want to override your white cells, you don't want to override your red cells. They got to be balanced in line position. Now set course centers, atom line routers, rotate line signals and floaters over screen, 2 centers of travel. Sets course timeline centers and set line course center, molecular line string location and bridging. Each cell modifies the line connection's heart that sets positional case to its bridging that correlates communication and setting, the operation of the 3 ventricle valves, process line communication and palpitation. Process that indicates the setting over lines of cross line connection setting. Convergence system of orange indicates over lines in the assembly line, disassemble, orange lines of sequence over cells over modification. Set and travels to point lines of graph indicates lines of flux. Process lines of purple over lines, inside rotation lines of circuit that correlates its calculation of time. So I'm just showing exactly what happens when you get inside position of the cells of operation. Okay? How to convert that position to a assembly line, but you have to dismantle, course centers, set, calculate, modify, retriangulate position lines, take it out of carbon, set course centers, line communication setting, process lines of crystalline, energize, liquidize, line communication, turn it into antimantle. The antimantle comes course centers, direct lines into anticaryon. Sets up the coolants, sets up the gravity, reshift lines of line communication setting, process lines of archetypes. Archetypes come in, convert the system, off the travel, modified line centers, each cell modifies the setting, colonizes the settings, and went through lines of graph of pi. That's right, they colonize each other. But they understand the direction of their system first. So each one has a line signal that processes indication over a cross line connection crossing bridge. Once they cross the bridge, they molecule in one center of one operation stream location. So all you're doing is putting all cells in one modification, one pi line connection setting, converts the system all through travel. By setting covert line centers a supercharging highway to each cell's modification in one bridge. Process indicates lines of position all to one cell into colonized system and all through tractions in all precision line centers, all in sequence, a one-track location system and provision locations to one big gigantic network that connects all highways all at once in travel. Your Earth. Okay? But you have to monetize your Earth lines and cell lines and bridging line core centers, your proton, electron, neutrons, and photons, and create an Earth line rotation of cell modification that colonizes everything in settings. Now, the indicate lines of screen lines is a one center flux, travel with point lines graph, indicates position. Once it gets an Earth tone, it goes in times of tablets. 4 centers of travel and 6 lines of measure. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sets course centers of bypassing lines of screen. Inside travel and point lines graph sets course centered energetic line course centers, setting sequence line calculation setting. So we go with black, And we interline course centers and interline entry points, exit points and course centers and constellation 1 centers. Indicate red over lines, 3 centers of measure, 4 lines of scale, 6 lines of setting, and 9 line position of travel. Okay? So, puts 9 seconds lines of frame, change course timeline, and line course centers and communication. Okay, so we got a mapping lines of pi, then we indicate line centers of the blue plasma, over lines of signals, and rotation lines of grounds, 3 centers of measure. Then we bring in the molecule line, design line, and 2 structures of bridging. Bridging of 3 triangulation lines and causes lines of geometric lines of scale. So that's coordinates of timeline, overline signals of 3 lines of scale, and void lines of scale. So you're processing your indication setting, and you're basically modifying your system all through travel and direction. Putting it all together into ground centered sequence. Platitude over lines, 3 over scale, indicate lines of data formation lines of setting. There it is. It's all together. So you have to understand how it coordinates communicated divisional cortex that each cell line modified line center location information bits that colonize the system on 1/3 graph and 3 centers of docking and 4 lines of scale of travel. Okay, very complicated stuff, guys, but it's a lot of fun. But look at all this communication setting. You set up your highways in your Earth rotation setting through colonization. Okay? All right. I think we'll stop there in traction. You guys are going. All right, so that's modification of grounds, lines of setting, location, your symbolism. They have to retract position locations, out of frame, out of sight, out of mind, out of sound. That puts all communications to really understand the reaction that you are in the body that you have to recognize. Out of sync, out of mind, out of calculation, out of pi. Process lines of the void, understand the body itself, the interconnection system to its own symbiote and location setting. Coming into line course centers comes into bandwidth. Process lines and link line screen adaptation system puts all communication system all through tractions. All right? See you in 5.